The 2020 elections may be beyond us, but voter reform remains a hot topic. What are the proposals that we're looking at, and what are the pros and cons of these proposals? Frank DeVito, attorney and board member of the Northampton County Election Commission, joined us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm your host, Sam Chen. Election 2020 may be beyond us, so to speak, but the question of voter reform is not going away. Voter reform, election reform, questions of election security have been with us long before 2020 and are here to stay. So what are the proposals that are out there, and what are the pros and cons of these proposals? Frank DeVito is an attorney with Lesavoy Butts and Sites here in the Lehigh Valley, and is also a board member of the Northampton County Election Commission, right in the heart of Swing County, USA. And he joins us here tonight. Frank, welcome to Face the Issues. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And before we jump into this, how are you and your family doing, especially amid the chaos of 2020?
Oh, I mean, we can't complain. The legal work was interesting, took a little bit of creativity, but we've been going strong. Family's doing well.
Good. Glad to hear that. Frank, let's just get right into this. You sit on the board, the Election Commission in Northampton County, and for you, this began well before 2020. And in 2019, going back a little bit, 2019, the state of Pennsylvania started introducing new voting machines, and a number of counties across the state, and again, this is the Keystone State. This is the state that the eyes of the nation are upon during a presidential election year. And in 2019, a number of counties just agreed to at least try these machines ahead of the rollout. Northampton County, where you live, being one of them, Philadelphia being one of them. And the result in Northampton County was interesting, to say the least. A lot of machine malfunctions. Walk us through that a little bit, especially as a member of that commission. What happened on Election Day in 2019?
Well, it was interesting. I had my name submitted for the Election Commission in late 2019, but I was actually commissioned and began the work on 1/1/2020. So I came in right in the wake of the malfunction, but was already up to speed and caught up pretty quickly on what had happened. So the malfunctions were several. To back up, the actual issue, the new machines are touchscreen, as a lot of counties and states are implementing. And most of the issues, it seems, had to do with the calibration and the precision of the actual touchscreens. Voters complaining in large numbers that they were touching one area and it was lighting up a different candidate or party. The straight party votes were not quite working, especially because we had some candidates who were cross-filed for both parties. So people were complaining that they were actually voting for people that they were not trying to vote for. It was made for a messy night.
Yeah, I remember that night. I remember watching returns and seeing key major party candidates with 6 votes, 60% of the way through the night, thinking, wait, something has gone wrong in Northampton County. Where does that stand now? Because it got buried with the chaos of 2020. I remember the day after the election, one of the executives from the company that made the machines took a red eye out and flew out to Northampton County. It was a big deal. We did an entire episode on it here. And then 2020 happens and everything is thrown to chaos. What's the current status with those machines?
Right. So immediately after, as you said, ES&S executives flew in and they did instant cleanup, and I think they did a fairly good job. I was brought in and given a tour of the machines, what they perceived went wrong, how they fixed them, recalibrated them. And it seemed to go well. First of all, I thought that their demonstration was convincing, that they had caught the problems. Unfortunate that they didn't catch them before an election, but that's neither here nor there. But the test was, after all the recalibrations and the assurances that they were fixed, we did have the primary and no major reported issues with the machines. So the caveat there is they haven't been tested on a massive level. The primary was experienced a lot of mail-in votes, so primaries are already lower turnout, and then you add in all the mail-ins. They weren't really stress tested, but we're hoping that those are all in the rearview mirror at this point.
And so, and the state's decision to roll out these new machines is continued, correct? It's not, the state didn't hit pause on that regulation.
Well, the state was, if I have this correctly, and I believe I do, the state was subsidizing the purchase of new machines, but those are county by county choices. So I know a lot of counties used similar or identical machines, but this was a Northampton County decision to buy these particular machines at that particular election cycle.
Okay, and well, it's good to know, and let's we hope, fingers crossed, that the successful trials are a promising thing for the future. But Frank, you brought something up as you were talking about that, and that's the idea of the mail-in ballots. And again, we've covered this on this program. The mail-in ballots were not done because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was something that the state of Pennsylvania had decided to move toward in advance of 2020, and it certainly, I think, added more numbers to people who were voting by mail because of the pandemic. But this was something that the state had decided to do in advance. There was quite the debacle in the primary. We pushed the primary back in Pennsylvania a few weeks. Quite the debacle in counting votes. And I remember when you and I both sat with NPR, we were asked about the election results, and a month out, there were still races that were being counted. What was the holdup? Was it just that the sheer volume, or are there things that, or in Northampton County or elsewhere, are there things that are actually causing a holdup with the mail-in ballots?
Yeah, there are a couple of issues, and these issues also are county by county. So one of the surprising and successful things in Northampton County, we actually had the mail-in ballots counted, and I believe there were about 60,000 of them, 40 to 60,000, something like that. They were counted that night. We actually had mail-in final counts, I believe, before we had the precinct in-person ballot counts. But that's county by county. I think we were extra prepared because of our problems in the 2019 election, but the election office did a good job. I think the delays overall were caused by a couple of things. First of all, and we'll probably get to this, but the pre-canvass, which is the point at which the election office can actually open the envelopes and begin to prepare for the count, that can only begin on election day right now, 7 a.m. on election day. That was the case in the primary as well. So then you have these tens of thousands of ballots, and the elections office can't even open them until the day of election day. So that leads to delays. And then you just have the counting machines. These things have to be physically counted, and there's tens of thousands of them even in the primary. I know we had 2 of the 4 machines malfunction while counting, so that slowed it down a little. Fortunately, we had backups. But now you amplify the amount of mail-in ballots that will come in for the general election. And the fact that these machines are actually in short supply, and you have a problem, I think, for getting results on election night this year.
One of the things about the counting, both Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature want to move that time you can begin counting the ballots up. Republicans want 3 days up. Democrats want 7 days up. Do you think it's beneficial to allow them to start counting the ballots earlier than Election Day?
Yes, with caveats. So definitely beneficial, of course, because I think that a large amount of the holdup is going to be those pre-canvassings rather than the actual physical counting, because the machines can count thousands of ballots per hour. That's not a huge holdup. The concern is that there's concern about chain of custody, where these ballots go, especially once they're opened, who's watching them, who's moving them. And so it's been central in the news cycle, especially here in Pennsylvania, about the large amount of poll watchers, ballot opening watchers who will be employed from both parties and candidates to oversee this process. That's where the biggest hesitation comes in, is that both parties, I can speak more to the Republicans because I know more people in the local party, but I think both parties want eyes on the whole process, right? So that's, I think, the biggest issue is if you can open ballots from 1 week before election day to election day, then both parties need to be sending volunteers, staffing for 3 days or a week or however long consistently. So personally, what I would like to see if there's a pre-canvass, that we have them on set days, maybe for 12 hours, 2 weeks before election day, and then for 12 hours, 3 days before election day, something like that. So we can, it's manageable, so we can watch it. So it's a little bit more secure and less of an open window of time.
Sure, that's a sensible proposal. And let me ask you this as well. The other issue I think at hand is that in the primary, the governor extended the deadline for mail-in ballots in 7 counties. In the general now, it's extended for all 67 counties in the Commonwealth until the Friday after the election. Pros are obviously if the mail was slow, you could still get the mail in. Cons, we're not going to know who won the state election night. But does this increase a potential for fraud? Is there a concern there that that there's something larger, more nefarious than we're just not going to know who the winner is?
At least potentially. I always hesitate to say there will be fraud or there will be this until we actually see the dust settle and see what's happened. But so if I can take one step back on this, if I understand the law correctly, one of the things that troubles me is the changes to the election code. Act 77 was passed last year, and then Act 12 clarifying things pertaining to these mail-in ballots. I believe the language in the statute was fairly clear that the voter registration office has to receive the mail-in ballots by 8 p.m. on election day. And you mentioned a governor's order, but I think when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled on a lot of these issues, it was mid-September. I think September 16th it came down. They interpreted that as long as it's postmarked by 8 o'clock on election day and received by the Friday after. And the textualist lawyer in me has to stop and comment on that, because if there was a reason to allow ballots to be received until Friday, fine, but the legislature should pass a law. It shouldn't be changed around by people who don't have the right to make law. So just thought I'd put that in.
Yeah, so it less of a concern perhaps on the fraud end, but more of a concern on the question of institutions, responsibilities, roles, and just the power and where that power rests, which is a concern that we've seen not just in the state but across the country. During this election. So, Frank, I appreciate that insight. I want to continue this conversation. We're going to cut the break, but don't go away. When we come back, we're going to continue this conversation. And also, what are some of the proposals that are being introduced, not just in Pennsylvania, but around the country? And are they good or bad? We'll be right back with that and more. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Frank, thank you again for being here. When we left off, we were talking about the mail-in ballots and the governor's extension of the deadline. And you left off commenting on the notion of institutions and their roles and responsibilities. And I wanted to revisit that. I know that you had more to say there before we went to break. So I want to give you an opportunity to come back to that question before we move on.
Thank you. Yeah, the one other point I wanted to make, because we had ended that segment saying, is it about who makes the law, or are there nefarious possibilities with this? And the one thing that does concern me is I believe this is also in the opinion from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that as long as the ballots are postmarked by election day, then they'll be accepted until that Friday. But there's a caveat in that opinion that if there's no postmark, and it's received by the Friday after election day, it will be assumed that it was postmarked on time. And I'm not an expert on mail and how all this works, but I believe that a lot of these mail-in ballots I don't know if it's prepaid or how the mail works, but I've been told by election law experts that a lot of these things won't actually have postmarks on them. So if you're looking for or afraid of fraud, there is the opportunity, at least in theory, that between election day and the Friday after, that ballots can be snuck in that aren't technically postmarked, and they'll be assumed timely.
Yeah, that is of concern. I want to stay on this topic of mail-in ballots, and in Pennsylvania, two of the things that had came about in both went to court. The judiciary ruled on both of them. One was the idea of the signatures on the back of your envelopes do not need to match. And the idea is that the name needs to match. I can't sign Frank DeVito, you can't sign Sam Chen, but the signature doesn't need to match. And I think that what they're trying to do here is allow for if someone has had a stroke or someone's handwriting changes over time. Of course, the other question is, what if someone tries to forge a signature? Is that of concern? Is this and if it is, what's the resolution?
Yeah, I wish I had better answers to these kind of things because I tend to take a nuanced view on a lot of this stuff because on one hand I'm concerned. It's common sense that the person who fills out and signs the ballot should be the same person whose name is on the ballot. But I'm also sympathetic to the arguments, even short of stroke, that people's signatures change. Some people sign with a swoop. It doesn't look anything like their name. The people who are in charge of going through tens of thousands of these things are not handwriting experts. And then it can become kind of a subjective criterion to throw out ballots. So that concerns me as well.
Sure. And then the other one is the privacy envelope. And again, the idea here that your ballot goes into a privacy envelope that then goes into the envelope that gets mailed back. And your name is not on the privacy envelope. And that's to protect the right of a secret ballot. And of course, the concern being how many voters are going to discard the privacy ballot or the privacy envelope. Are there concerns here that a mass amount of votes will be uncounted?
It's always possible. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of that being a mass number only because along with the mail-in ballot campaign, every candidate who encourages their constituents to vote by mail-in, there are tons of mailings. I'm sure you've received a lot of them over this election cycle, encouraging you to vote by mail. They come with detailed instructions and all of that. So yes, it's possible, and it probably is likely that some people won't follow the directions and will get rid of the secrecy envelope. But I think that they're a necessary thing for a couple of reasons. For one, it's an added layer of something that's hard to duplicate rather than just a naked ballot, that you want to have this system of several things that need to be in place to authenticate the ballot. And also it's reasonable, like you said, to protect the privacy of the voter, their name, their party, their choices for election. I think that's a reasonable thing.
Yeah. So along the line, and I just want to ask you a little bit, I mean, Pennsylvania is going through this, whether it was the new machines, the mail-in ballots, a lot of questions on voter security, voter reform, and just how they increase the accessibility to vote. And a number of other states do things that we don't do here in the Commonwealth, such as early voting. The state of Texas has a 2-week period, 2-3-week period in which you can actually show up to vote in person early, as well as something called same-day registration, where you could literally go to the polls and register that day. In Pennsylvania, you need to be registered about a month before the election takes place. What are your thoughts on things like proposals like early voting, same-day registration? First of all, will it actually do what it's designed to do and increase voter turnout and engagement? And secondly, are there concerns on the voter security end with these proposals?
Yeah, so the same day voter registration, I'm a little skeptical. If I could be shown that it works, that it's going to increase turnout, I'm not fundamentally against it. The security issues are something that I don't really have too much expertise to weigh in on, although it would probably make a little bit of a chaotic situation for voter registration offices who actually have to manage and keep track of the lists of who can vote, especially when you throw in the possibility of mail-in ballots. But I guess if the goal is to increase voter engagement, I don't know. I think anybody who would be or want to be engaged in the voting process would be likely to register before the last day, but I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'd be interested to hear arguments on it. As for the early voting, I've been thinking about this a lot, especially with what's gone on in this election cycle with tens of millions of people voting in the weeks before the actual election day. But then you see all the things that happened in the last days before the election. And then you throw in having 2 presidential candidates who are in their 70s, whose health has been questioned for various reasons. The president was hospitalized with COVID. And it's like, if somebody's sick, if something incapacitates a candidate, don't the people want to know up to the last second who it is that they're actually voting for? So that's my biggest concern, I think, with the early voting, is that you're encouraging people to vote before all the issues are actually out on the table, before the actual election takes place.
In a situation with early voting, would you recommend, I mean, obviously the country is not doing it right now, various states can. Would you recommend, for example, moving up the presidential debates? Because otherwise you have people voting right well before the debates even begin.
Yeah, I mean, if the reality is there's going to be early voting, then I think it makes sense, right? I mean, there was a debate, a week and a half, 2 weeks before Election Day, and like I said, I think 47 million or something votes had already been cast. So I think that's a reasonable proposal. Yes, if this is the reality, then earlier debates make good sense to me.
Let me ask you this, Frank. What about voter ID? Now, voter ID is probably one of the more controversial proposals that come up, and you'll hear people say, "Oh, well, early voting and same-day registration allows us to increase the voter rolls, and voter ID is actually turning people away from voting." But on the voter security side, the argument becomes, look, you need the ID to buy cigarettes, you need the ID to go to see R-rated movie, you need the ID for so many things. Is it too much to ask? Because there are requirements on voting. It's not just a free-for-all. There are requirements to be an eligible voter. Is it too much to ask that you have to verify that? Do you see this proposal coming to pass? And what do you see as the pros and challenges to it?
It's interesting. So I grew up and spent a good deal of my life in Connecticut, which is a lot more liberal of a state in most respects than Pennsylvania. And voter ID was the norm. We always had to present an ID to vote. And so I'm at least sympathetic to hearing more of the voter disenfranchisement arguments. But to me, it's common sense that you have to, right, there are certain requirements. You have to have a residency requirement. You have to be eligible to vote. It's not unreasonable or crazy to ask that people prove that they are who they are in order to vote. So if ID are really inaccessible to certain, demographics, then that has to be addressed. The IDs should be easy to acquire, but I don't think it's a reason to not have IDs at the polls.
So with the solution you're proposing then is to make IDs more accessible. And that it should
Assuming that they're not already. I don't know the answer to that, but yes.
Yeah. And let me ask you one more along the same lines with the voter ID line is some states are mailing ballots to everyone on the voter rolls. And obviously, the concern with this, and we hear people talk about, well, I've received 5 mail-in ballots and 3 of the people don't live at my residence anymore. And does Northampton County do this, and should counties do this, which is regularly update their voter rolls? I mean, how often are voter rolls updated, and is this a practice that we should do for voter security purposes?
Yeah, I've asked our county election office at an election commission meeting whether the voter rolls were being purged, and they said yes, they actually have contact with the coroner's office and they keep an update for when people pass away. So from what I've heard, this county has fairly robust protocols. I hope that's the case, and I think it certainly should be the case. And as for the mass mailing of ballots to every citizen, I personally have huge concerns with that.
Sure.
I mean, to your point, anecdotally, but I receive mail from 3 or 4 different previous tenants or owners of my house on a regular basis. So yeah, that's frightening because our whole system works on one person, one vote. So I don't think it's a good idea. I think there are too many people, too many holes in the system to just mail out a ballot to everybody without some kind of a check on that.
Sure. Real quick, to close out this segment, Frank, what if you could propose something that would help increase voter turnout while remaining, holding voter security in place? What would be that proposal?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think to the point about voter IDs, I think to subsidize them or to make it absolutely certain that every citizen has access to a state ID, that's common sense. I don't think it'd be too expensive or difficult of a proposition. And then to require IDs would definitely be one reform. And then to make sure that as the technology updates, as we get electronic voting machines, electronic sign-in, poll books, just to make sure that there are paper backups and that whatever we're implementing with technology is still easily auditable and traceable to make sure that nothing is getting lost in the ether.
Yeah, fair enough. Frank DeVito, thank you again for your time, and don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Frank, thank you again for joining us and for your insights. We like to close every program, just kind of get to know our guests a little bit better. And I understand you practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, talk about voter security. What got you into it, and what do you enjoy about it?
Sure. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I'm kind of an enigma. I remember going through law school, I was involved with the Federalist Society and was working to get published. And I'm really interested in a lot of these kind of nerdy legal issues. And then I would also go and practice the art of controlling and strangling people, right? No, but seriously, so Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu actually means the gentle art. And what I thought was really fascinating about it when I was, I've always been interested in fitness and also in self-defense. And so I was looking at the different martial arts. And one of the really cool things about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is that it doesn't rely on strikes, right? So there's no direct, punching, kicking, elbowing. It's the act of controlling people with movement, with leverage, with weight distribution. So I always found that really cool, is that for one, the little weaker, smaller person can actually defeat the larger, stronger person with the right technique. And also that it's really scalable. That Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we've seen from all the way to life or death situations, that the terrorist situation on the train in France, that was stopped by a couple of military personnel. They were using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques to end that threat. But all the way down to somebody who's like had a little too much to drink and needs to be restrained from doing something stupid. It's very scalable in how much force you use. So I find the malleability and the potential gentleness for it pretty interesting and fun to do.
That is absolutely fascinating, and here's hoping you'll never have to use that in the courtroom or in any situation like that. Yeah. Frank, thank you for joining us. That is all the time that we have tonight. Thank you for tuning in, and continue this conversation with us online. Just remember to use the hashtag #FaceTheIssues. And join us again next week as we unpack another issue. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.